Hello, everyone. My name is Silo, and welcome to my podcast. Now, I've been an avid fan of horror, cryptids, the supernatural, and just about anything plain old spooky or unexplained for probably as long as I can remember. You see, I love learning about, the paranormal and just anything unknown that basically keeps us up at night. Now, for a while now, I've been thinking about ways I could sort of reinforce my creative side while also gaining some kind of online presence. And after I thought about it for just a little while, I realized, well, I do really enjoy listening to podcasts on long drives. I enjoy listening to podcasts while I'm out on walks or completing chores or anything. So I figured I think the best avenue for me to really, hinge onto my creative side and kind of create an online presence is to, create podcasts. And that way I can put out content that I would enjoy doing while, talking about things and researching things that I just, I love. Now, the kinds of things I will be talking about on this podcast, I sort of touched up on at the beginning here, but, it was briefly mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat that and add on to that list. So a few things I will be discussing on this podcast will be ghosts and hauntings, cryptids, myths and legends, aliens, horror movies, horror shows, SCPs, etc. Pretty much anything horror or cryptid related. As you can see, we've got the witch, we've got a bunch of cryptids behind me. We got, this skeleton thing. It's big fan of horror, big fan of cryptids, the supernatural, anything, out there and unexplained. I think one of my favorite things about learning about hauntings and cryptids and anything kind of unexplained has to do with the history behind it. So I like to learn about the histories and haunts of a specific location, the facts behind an event, the facts behind a specific legend or a myth. And I want to try to dig as deeply as I can and just talk about those things without overly boring myself or, my listeners. Now, since I did mention multiple topics just a second ago there are going to be multiple segments on the podcast. Now, the main segment will be called Legends and Lore, and this is going to be a segment where I'll be discussing the history, events, sightings, and experiences of things like cryptids, haunted locations, and myths or legends of a specific place. Now, the way I'll be doing this is I'll be sitting in front of a camera, as I am right now, in the same exact spot, and essentially I'll just be reading a script because, well, I feel like that's the best way to get the knowledge and facts straight. If I just kind of tried to remember, I would most likely miss a lot. So I'll be reading off a script based off of my extensive research that I've completed from different places around the internet or books I pick up. And of course, I will be citing all my sources. So if you guys ever want to do more research on your own, you can always look at those sources or just, find your own sources. And of course, there will be other segments where I'll be discussing horror movies and TV shows, but I haven't really decided on what that segment is going to be called yet. Now, I will say that the segments involving horror movies and TV shows will likely, or just, I guess on occasion, have a guest appearance from a friend of mine or a fellow horror lover that I know. Now, for those of you wondering where these podcasts will be available, well, there's a few different options. There is, of course, YouTube. If you're seeing this in video form, they're going to be placed on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. And I'll likely eventually branch out onto TikTok, but that might not be right away. It just depends on how long the video is and how well I can format it. I just don't like seeing multiple different parts, like part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. That's kind of always irritated me, and if I have to do it, I'll do it. Just I'd prefer not to. Now, of course, if you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, then you'll get to see my lovely face, my recording area, and some images that I'll be putting up on the screen to go along with the topic I'm discussing, and, well, all this background and stuff, that I think is pretty neat. Now, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts and or Spotify, then, of course, you will only have my angelic voice to listen to. So now, moving on, how exactly did I get into the world of, spooky, paranormal, cryptids, and the unknown? Well, as a kid, I absolutely loved shows like Courage the Cowardly Dog, Real Monsters, and Are You Afraid of the Dark? While Real Monsters didn't really frighten me or freak me out or anything like that, I did think it was kind of weird, and it kind of pulled me in. It had its own little charm for some reason to it. On the other hand, Courage the Cowardly Dog and Are You Afraid of the Dark just really, it was just nightmare fuel to me. And, it caused many sleepless nights, and my mom being very angry at me for waking her up at like 3 a.m. because I'm scared. So, yeah, that was fun, but I loved every moment of it, of course. At around maybe early 2008, I started seeing these like really interesting commercials on Cartoon Network that showed these like found footage style video with cryptids in them. Now, the end of the commercial would take you to this like blue screen that kind of looked like corrupted camera footage, and it would tell you to visit this website, cryptidsarereal.com. And the combination of these like found footage cryptid videos of kids my age, or roughly my age, and this really cool website that, showed all these sightings, this and that, even though, albeit most of them were probably fake, it just really pulled me in hardcore. So at that point, I became like absolutely fascinated by Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra. Pretty much anything cryptid at that point was on my radar. I even went so far as to write these like fake newspaper articles with like ridiculous names like Bigfoot Gets Married or The Kraken Takes Down a Cruise Ship. And it's kind of embarrassing now that I look back at it, but it is what it is. So now, these commercials, I would eventually come to find out, were advertising for a show called The Secret Saturdays that would premiere not long after these commercials aired. And I can really thank these commercials for the immense amount of interest and love for reading about cryptids that I currently have. As I kind of got a little bit older, I started watching this more terrifying cryptid/horror style show that aired on Animal Planet called Lost Tapes, and that probably wasn't a good idea because, I was still pretty young, and I was just, that show creeped me the hell out. I'm not even gonna lie, but I love it. So now, when I was a kid, the thoughts of ghosts and the afterlife kind of absolutely freaked me out because, when you're young, you think you're immortal and that you're just gonna live forever. Nothing can hurt you. And then reality kind of sets in and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to die and there's an afterlife and I'm going to get haunted and ghosts and this and that. But eventually I just kind of got over that, sort of. And I just became really fascinated with the topic of ghosts and the afterlife. I started reading some short ghost stories. I started watching Ghost Adventures on the Travel Channel. I started watching Ghost Hunters on Sci-Fi and A Haunting on the Discovery Channel. Now, of course, no child who loves spooky things would be complete without a collection of spooky books. Now, I loved reading and watching Goosebumps. That was a lot of fun. I loved exploring the mystery of the Skeleton Creek series, as well as being haunted by the short stories of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And that book wasn't just terrifying because of the stories. The images were just, what the hell were you thinking? These are kids' books. So then, of course, came YouTube. And YouTube has been around since I was in elementary school. But I never really watched it. My parents thought it was going to give our computer viruses. And also our internet was too slow. So you'd have to start a video, pause it, and kind of let it load for 20 minutes just to kind of get halfway before you actually watched it, because our internet just sucked. Eventually, though, as I got older, I started watching PewDiePie. And the first video I ever watched from PewDiePie was Slender, the 8 Pages. And I'm going to tell you right now, Slender Man, I just loved learning about Slender Man. I would watch all these kind of YouTube videos on the Slender Man. I would read these things about Slender Man. I eventually kind of branched out onto Jeff the Killer and, Sonic.exe, or, all those creepypastas kind of pulled me in because of PewDiePie and his Slender video, which kind of put me down a rabbit hole. But after I watched all of the, videos he posted on Slender, I binge watched his entire Amnesia series because that was just really fun. And I would also just go in and binge watch every single horror game he'd play. And anytime he'd post a new video involving a horror game, immediately I was hooked. I was like, this is it. I'm going to watch this before bed. I'm going to have a good time, turn off all the lights. It was a lot of fun. Now, of course, we can't forget Markiplier. That man is absolutely phenomenal. I love all of his videos. I love his content. And I'll never forget the first video I watched from him was this game he played called Mental Hospital. And it was a horror game. And I thought he was a little weird at first because I was so hooked on PewDiePie and watching him. But I ended up just liking him more than PewDiePie. And I watch him till this day. I'd also would binge watch all of his Five Nights at Freddy's videos. And I think he actually still posts those all the time. And I watch pretty much everything that he posts revolving around horror or, creepy games because those are just a blast to watch. It's fun watching other people get scared and scaring yourself in the process. Now, we can't forget horror movies. I love those. Now, I will admit it took me a while to get into horror movies when I was younger because I watched Chucky at a very young age, and I was convinced that horror movies were, like, real. I was terrified of dolls. I still am terrified of dolls. Dolls just freak me out. Ask my girlfriend. Don't like them. I just don't. I eventually came around and I started watching tons of horror movies, and I think the first one I can truly remember watching at a younger age was The Hills Have Eyes, and I watched it at our friend's house. And after that, I think I watched The Exorcist, which I didn't think was scary at all. I thought it was actually kind of funny because I don't know. I don't know why it freaks so many people out. I also watched The Ring and A Haunting in Connecticut. I will say The Ring and A Haunting in Connecticut definitely freaked me the heck out as a kid. It was classics, absolute classics. After watching those movies and kind of getting more into horror, I just pretty much started watching every horror movie that came my way, from the classics to the modern movies. So I've watched tons, and I have plenty to talk about. So aside from podcast segments, those people that tune into this podcast here on YouTube might eventually get content like original short horror stories, original short horror videos, and horror gameplay. So either gameplay just by myself or with friends where we play just a spooky game. And I don't know what else will come on the podcast or on this channel, but for now, that's kind of what's planned out. So make sure that you follow and subscribe, and when my first episode releases, make sure that you get into your spooky year-round Halloween spirit and channel your inner witch and or warlock as you delve into the mind of Silo and his spooky universe.